is it's not endogenously determined. You just kind of assume it's one constant level of like subsequent increases in capital, we just as productive as all the capital we had before. That's where it comes into the productivity index. He also claims that this model is just very rigid. There's rigid assumptions all over the place. There's a fixed capital to labor ratio, there's a fixed capital to income ratio, and there's a fixed labor to income ratio. In reality, economies are very dynamic. These ratios can change over time. A major limitation of this model then relates to this idea that there's no possibility to substitute between capital and labor in the Herod-Domar growth model because we assume these fixed ratios. Third, Easterly claims that this ignores the role for technological change and leads us to believe, this is fourth critique, that simply dealing with the financing gap, and I'll put that term on the board, simply alleviating the financing gap is a guarantee of economic growth. And so he calls this Domar's ever-guilty conscience. This model was never supposed to be a model of economic growth. It was supposed to simply relate to advanced industrial countries, but instead it was applied uniformly in the World Bank and other international financial institutions to determine the required savings rate of an economy in order to induce a certain target growth rate that would be magically hit over time. Yes?
I'm sorry, what does relieving the financing gap do?
So, if you want to grow at a certain rate, okay? Just pick some rate. Let's say we want to grow 10% because that'll double our income in 7 years, right? Then in order to get there, we need to induce the poor country to save, or to increase the savings rate, which will lead to investment, which will lead to higher growth in the self-fulfilling and mutually beneficial cycle. The financing gap pertains to the difference between savings and investment in low-income countries. We'll talk about this more when we get to the aid lecture, but it's the concept of aid taking the place of domestic savings, which would lead to greater savings, albeit foreign-induced, and in turn greater investment. That's what the financing gap is. The difference between our desired amount of savings and in turn investment and the actual amount of savings that we have. Okay?
I think you said that you made a comment that leads to one to believe that dealing with the financing gap is a guarantee of economic growth, but that's not true.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I said. And the reason being that as we've seen, I mean, we give lots and lots of money to low-income countries, and yet they grow at very poor rates. Some of that relates to institutions, incentives. We'll talk about all the reasons why that doesn't hold, but that's a critique. Yeah? Any other questions on Herod-Domar? What do you guys think of the model? Convinced? Just raise savings and have more durable capital, we can grow forever? No? Okay. Well, but? No?
No, because after reading Easterly, he just goes through a list of countries, the predicted growth rate versus reality.
Yeah. Yeah, it try not to get too nihilistic when reading Easterly. He has a tendency to do that to you. Well, we'll talk more after a break. Why don't we take 5 minutes and then we'll jump into the Rostovian take-up model and solo. Okay? Take 5 minutes, come back at 7:10. Okay? And Rayhona, Samia, Mario, Richard, Claudia, Sonia, and Serena, can you please see me now? Thank you. Okay, did you register for the course?
Question.
Yeah.
Are you finished the whole course? Okay, so I will.
And actually, can you fill out one of these?
Review sessions on different topics. So like today,
Hi,
it's going to be on
you guys.
basic
I
math. Other days it'll be
So you just filled out the
days.
class.
So Thursday will be an ATA session,
Didn't see the second
going over some of
side.
the stuff that's already been covered and prepping for the
Oh,
whole
cool.
session.
Oh, that means June the slot, or
outside the start. Oh, after. Oh, but it's totally
Okay, there's two sides.
It's just kind of more basic, way top. If you want to come in, you don't have to. Oh, basically it's the same room here, and you just stay here, and then you do some sort of reviews and stuff like that, for assignments and understanding and stuff like that.
Exactly.
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah.
And you do that like every Thursday, or?
It'll be every Tuesday, but this week we're gonna have two, since you wanted a math review
Okay.
as well. I'll also have office hours so people can meet individually and go over stuff. What? For them, like, if they want to do it outside of the classes. And, yeah, just basically general support.
Oh, okay, I get it. I wasn't sure how you fit it into the whole
Yeah,
thing.
no, all the economics courses, it's nice.
Yeah.
I think all the teaching assistants.
Oh, okay.
Help the professor.
Oh, good to know.
Yeah.
So today you will go through math.
Yeah, so it'll cover exponents, like the basic rules of exponents,
And
logarithms,
yeah.
differentiation, some of the copped up stuff.
okay.
It's not
So
super
if we
advanced.
understand the math companion, we don't really have to bother.
You're certainly welcome, but yeah, it probably wouldn't be the best use of your time. Sorry.
Hey, you're good.
I had a question.
What's up?
Is B a ratio or a percentage or
It is it's a good question. Yeah, so it's some multiples. So it might be like a 3. Let's say the capital is about 30 billion, output is 10 billion, 3 is
Okay. So
We think it was the capital intensity of the economy.
I'm more about
Yeah,
sort
sure.
of professional based.
Yeah.
I don't really understand that. If you say you have these great institutions, you have these great models, you have, I mean, you read all these one state, all that same, the best case for the ego.
Is that right?
And then you come to this country where everything is bad.
Isolation, consumption, yeah.
How is there some way mismatch between government
Oh, absolutely.
because it's so much.
You do, so that you work with federals.
I work for a contract.
Oh,
Mm-hmm.
for state.
So you then
Oh.
That's one reason.
Because that's, it's not new, it's, yeah.
It says 50 state financial systems with
Right, I would tell you, but I think I'd really realize that.
I work in the state financial department.
But what they do is they invest in assets, which are stores of value. Things like homes, stocks, bonds, which don't go down.
Administration
Oftentimes down with more credit, exactly. So, yeah, I mean, now whether or not that will always lead to economic growth. We can discuss it, but yeah, let's talk about it. It's in my after.
Does that include the account balance?
That was more the productivity of investment. They really lack a price system to tell you where to throw your money. So if you just think, I pay you $10 today, you won't fill it back up. That's $10 economic activity that's just placed in nothing. There's really the issue of aggregate supply, right? The demand is, you're employing it, that's good, but it's the profits that's bad, so markets tend to coordinate that better. That doesn't
All this stuff must make some amount of sense to you then. Oh, it's probably right there.
All right. So I want to speak briefly about the articles I passed out. Strongly recommend you read them. The first one that I passed out was entitled "The Global Fallout of a Eurozone Collapse," written by Kenneth Rogoff, and we have assigned many chapters of his fantastic book, I believe in lecture 11. So get used to reading him. And he talks about different options for the Eurozone. More pertinent to this class, though, is Gideon Rockman's article, "When China Becomes #1." And talking about China's role as an emerging superpower, the role that economic development played in great power politics, and he relies on certain linear projections, which may or may not be true, but it's an interesting piece nonetheless. Okay? In the final 45 minutes or so, I want to talk about the Rostovian takeoff model. And this was described in your book, but I also have an excerpt of this that I will pass around right now that you can read. Here you go. Read at your leisure.
Can you explain where in the book that's discussed? Or is there another name to it?
It's the takeoff model.
In this book.
No, it's not really discussed there. Easterly talks about it later on in his book.
His specific book.
Yeah, but that's why I'm giving you this. Is kind of this is the man himself, man in the legend. Okay. So Walt Whitman Rostov, this guy is he's fairly accomplished. He was a special assistant through 3 presidential administrations. He was also a child prodigy of sorts. He was a son of Russian Jewish immigrants. He attended Yale and graduated at 19. He earned his PhD at 24, and somewhere along the line, he was a Rhodes Scholar. So this guy is very, very accomplished, and he has a comprehensive theory of economic growth to boot. Rostov argued that economic modernization takes place along 5 stages. Okay? Those 5 stages are as follows. That of a traditional society, the preconditions for takeoff. The 3rd stage, which is very important, is takeoff. The 4th stage is the drive to maturity. And the 5th stage is the age of high mass consumption. Now, he described the very first stage as something that was pre-Newtonian world. You could think of this as the period of warring states in China, medieval Europe. He wrote with almost a sense of reckless abandon with regards to political correctness. He described in the traditional society an adherence to supernatural or superstitious beliefs, a dependence on agriculture, a lack of territorial integrity, and a real demotion of economic life as it pertains to human life. That's what traditional society is. Now, thereafter, we start to see in almost the 2nd stage certain elements of modernity taking root. We have the development of technologically savvy agriculture with machineries. We have rising savings rates, the beginnings of market structures in an economy. The key, as Rostov saw it, in the transition between stages 2 and 3 is really where lots of poor countries hit a snag in their road to economic development. In takeoff, savings go up, and also we have large-scale social changes in an economy. We have the rise of urbanization. We have the beginnings of heavy manufacturing, industrialization, and a real enshrinement of economic life is a central factor of both political and social life. Now, we'll talk about how to get here, the implications for economic growth, but I want to flesh out 4 and 5. After a country has reached takeoff, they no longer have a need for foreign intervention in the economy. They can rely on self-fulfilling and self-maintaining processes that allow them to continue to grow, to achieve maturity, and eventual mass consumption and convergence with the rest of the advanced industrial world. Okay? During the age of mass consumption, we have people focus on less economic activities, the frivolousness of art, music, etc., the rise of a leisure society. And so, this is very teleological. He believes that the economy will grow, that the role of economic development is central to political and social development. So it relates to this whole concept of modernization that we talked about last week. The key here to understanding Rostov is understanding why countries stay stagnant in the preconditions and why countries achieve takeoff. The answer, not surprisingly, is savings. Savings, and what he described is the benefits of compound interest, allow countries to engage in this process of self-sustaining growth. But it's very difficult for developing countries to achieve takeoff without the help of some foreign power. So his answer is simple. Advanced states need to make up for this shortfall in savings to allow countries to achieve takeoff. Question?
You know, all this is obviously second week class, but it seems very simple to me. And if you look at what's going on in this country today, right? I'm having China be our little banker all day long or something like that. So,
If you address that?
not in 1960s.
No, of course. No, that's I guess the weaknesses of the age of mass consumption that's built up on debt and leverage. I don't know. He never really dealt with that. No, fair enough. Yeah. Question.
Was this guy sort of this was the genesis of the investment gap that you were describing?
The financing gap,
Financing gap.
highly related to it. These things were kind of coterminous, but he really emphasized the need for the financing gap, filling the financing gap with aid and investment. Now, his desire to write this was largely politically oriented. I mean, the title of this is Stages of Economic Growth in Non-Communist Manifesto. He was trying to come up with almost a countervailing narrative of economic, political, and social development that the West could hang their hats on, especially, you know, in the face of Marxist-Leninism, which kind of presented this one comprehensive theory of the world. And so this is an economic development with that goal in mind. Yeah? Good question. Any other questions on this? You're right, it is simplistic. It is interesting. And unfortunately, this philosophical approach to development, or perhaps fortunately, depending on your point of view, is still heavily entrenched. At least in the economics literature, but certainly in the political development literature, and the role of economic growth therein. Now, Easterly has critiques. He's not a particular fan of this. He claims that there's very little evidence for the stages of Rostov, and that only 3 of the 15 cases Rostov cited actually fit the story of savings-led takeoff. Okay? So there is a dubious link between increased savings and rising economic growth, even in the cases that Rostov picked himself. Furthermore, this is the second major critique, the use of foreign aid to increase savings abroad in developing countries has no correlation with growth rates abroad. So the whole notion that we can fill a financing gap, he calls into question. He claims that foreign aid reached its historical max in 1985, yet this didn't correlate with the resurgence of foreign growth in any meaningful way. Any questions on Rostov? Yeah.
Does Easterly in his critique, I can't remember, does he, or does Rostov at all address that the foreign saving, or foreign aid, supplanted local savings, and that local savings were either used for other expenses, or were sent elsewhere, because saving in, putting your money in like Switzerland, or the United States, or your relatives who, either in the form of a bank or your relatives who are living there, is more effective than keeping it in a bank in Nigeria?
Yes, Rosso doesn't really talk about that, but Easterly definitely does. In the third part of his book, where he talks about all the perverse incentives that this aid regime supports. And one of those definitely pertains to, if you pay people not to save, which is really what you're doing, filling the financing gap, they might not save. So yeah, he definitely deals with that, and take a look at that part of the book. Question? Yeah, Quinn?
It seems like, I mean, Easterly's big critique is that savings doesn't start this process, right? But he does say, especially in the first part of the book, that growth is kind of like starts this like self-sustain. That growth is the only way to have sustainable development over a long period. So it does seem like there's kind of like it seems like he doesn't really argue with like kind of the takeoff notion, just more like what
the mechanisms to take off. Yeah, I think that's accurate. Yeah. Question?
You said this model still informs a lot of development policy. Is it because nothing superior has emerged, or is it still, do people still really believe in this?
So this is a big normative question. And the best I can do is kind of tell you what the dominant opinions out there are. But the major critique of this is that it's teleological, right? That it assumes that there's some end to which everybody's kind of evolving, and that, look, this notion of the age of mass consumption was heavily informed by the experiences of the West. So it's very West-centric, okay? Yes, there are alternative visions of development. You have kind of world systems theories, which are heavily informed by Marxism. You have the state-led capitalist theories, which are arguably championed by China, although they don't really put much voice to their development ideology. So the answer to your question is we don't really know which dominant school will win this battle of ideas, but this is definitely carved out its own place. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah, Jürgen?
I mean, the theory sounds pretty simple. Is the practice as simple? Is it just like someone in the West saying, I'm going to now invest $20 billion into a country and then they will take off? Is that sort of, or is there a lot more complexity behind it?
So this kind of laid the ideological groundwork for why aid might not just improve the conditions on the ground of a developing country, but also allow them to grow their way out of their problem. So it lays the philosophical groundwork for why we gave aid in the first place, particularly during the early second half of the 20th century.
Because it sounds a little bit like a sports team where you think you're going to buy the best players and you think you have a winning team, and often that's not the case.
Yes, that there's some, the whole might be less than the sum of the parts, that argument. Yeah, I think that's a fair critique. Yeah. Any other questions on Rostov? No? All right. Anyway, take a look at that, because he is, at least, if not directly, indirectly, still responsible for much of the use of foreign aid as a tool of fostering economic growth in the world today.
But I believe it will always be used, except that it's the way it's being monitored these days has been changed a lot.
Yeah, fair enough.
So you had targeted aid, and you had all the checks and balances, and when it even less.
Yeah.
Let's say 15 years ago, it
Mhm.
didn't happen.
No, that's
You
fair.
would give money, and then you would completely lose the track of what happened to the money.
Mhm. Yeah, it's better monitoring to make sure that aid is actually that definitely is all that makes sense. All right, so issue number 5, the solo growth model. So in the final 35 minutes here, I want to give you the basics of the solo growth model, which is also coincidentally the neoclassical growth model. If you were to take macroeconomics at SICE, your unit on economic growth would largely be the solo growth model. This is, for better or for worse, the most dominant growth paradigm over the past 100 years. Okay? So, Solow decided to answer some of Herod and Domar's shortcomings. And the first thing he did was drop the fixed coefficient production function and replace it with a neoclassical production function. So we're going to spend a little time talking about that. So recall that from Herod Domar, that model assumed that there were some fixed coefficient production functions. In the neoclassical model, we have isoquants that allow us to substitute between capital and labor. Looks something like this. Now notice that these isoquants are convex towards the origin. Okay? So they have a bent to them. And in order to see why, in this model, we can substitute between capital and labor, imagine we are at point A. This is. So what's our capital to labor ratio here? 1 to 10, right? So 1 unit of capital to 1 unit of labor. Now in the Herod-Domar model, that ratio was fixed, it was constant. That was the nature of the fixed coefficient production function. Now according to Solow, it's possible, if we want to scale production from 1,000 to 2,000, that we can change our capital to labor ratio accordingly. We can go from point A to point B. What would happen to our capital to labor ratio if we expanded from point A to point B? It would be fixed, right? It wouldn't change. If we went from point A to point C, what would happen to our capital to labor ratio? Exactly. It increases in favor of capital. In other words, it becomes more capital intensive. Okay? At point C. The way to see that, just look at the slope of the ray from the origin. You'll see that it's necessarily steeper. Okay, see that? Okay. And finally, at point D, it becomes more labor intensive. All of these expansion paths through point B, through point C, and through point D allow us to increase output the same amount. Because all of these points fall along the same isoquant, and the output along any given isoquant is fixed. That is a key departure. Furthermore, Solow assumes that this relationship can be explained mathematically using a neoclassical production function. So this is the graphical representation of the production function, yeah? This will become the algebraic expression. Get used to working with both, okay? The goal of any explanation in this course is to be able to explain things in words, explain things in symbols, and also to show them graphically or illustrate them, okay? So that's how every time you come to some conclusion, be able to substantiate it in all three ways, okay? So we're going to use something known as a Cobb-Douglas production function. Y equals A times k to the alpha, L to the 1 minus alpha. By show of hands, who's seen a Cobb-Douglas production function before? Okay, a little under half, yeah, more or less. In undergrad? Okay. Now the Cobb-Douglas production function in this specific form, okay? Well, first I want to just tell you what each of these variables are. First, K and L, you guys know, capital and labor, yeah? Alpha is labor's share, or pardon me, capital's share of income. Okay? And therefore, 1 minus alpha is labor's share of income. Okay? Labor share of income plus capital share of income equals 1 or 100% of total income. Make sense? Okay. In Y is output. Term A you could think of is total factor productivity. Any questions on the terms, the letters, what they mean? Okay.
Sorry,
Yeah, question in the back.
1 minus alpha again?
That's labor share of income.
And then you said 1, what was the next thing you said?
Oh, and so if we were to add labor share of income, 1 minus alpha,
Right.
plus capital share of income, alpha, we would just get 1, which is of course 100%, or the total income that can possibly be split between both of them. Okay? So, the easiest way to envision this is to actually give you a numerical example. So let's say I gave you a production function that looks something like this. Okay, that's your garden variety production function, a Cobb-Douglas production function. Okay? The first thing I want to show you, or the first question I ask, is what type of returns to scale does this production function exhibit? Yeah.
Sorry,
Okay.
because it's a constant in the sense
But
that-
why?
Because the alpha is essentially the same, not the alpha, well, how are you reasoning, the exponent is the same.
Okay. Your intuition serves you well, but how might I show it mathematically? How might I verify? Yeah, Sam?
By substituting 2k and 2l in for k and l, and if y doubles, then it's constant.
Okay, so recall that constant returns to scale, we claim that if we double capital and double labor, y will exactly double. Right? Constant returns to scale. So let's observe and see using this production function whether or not that's the case. So we don't know what's going to happen with y, so there's a question mark here. We're going to say 10 times 2k quantity to the 1/2 times 2l quantity to the 1/2. Okay? From here, we can distribute the 1/2s, or the exponents. Everybody see this step? Everybody remembers the rule of exponents covered magnificently in their math companion? Okay, well, I believe your TA will be going over this at some point in the near future. Yep. So in case you have any questions on exponents, but step 2 to step 3 is as such. Furthermore, we can separate out, we can combine like terms. So we can say 2 to the 1/2 times 2 to the 1/2 times quantity 10 times k to the 1/2 L to the 1/2. Okay? And anytime we have the same base, we can add the exponents. So this becomes 2 times 10 k to the 1/2 L to the 1/2. And what is 10 times k to the 1/2 L to the 1/2 equal? Y. So we can claim that this does in fact equal to y. Doubling in both inputs exactly doubles our output. Therefore, what types of returns to scale does this have? Constant returns to scale. This is how we verify it. Okay? Okay. I'll give you a hint, so you don't have to do this proof every time. If you add the exponents on your Cobb-Douglas production function, if you add these together, and they equal 1, you have constant returns to scale. I'm sorry?
It's a lot easier.
That's a lot easier? Yeah. If you add them together and they're greater than 1, you have increasing returns to scale. If you add them together and they're less than 1, you have decreasing returns to scale. Okay? Don't believe me though, prove it to yourself. Make up exponents that sum up to greater than 1 and plug in 2 for each one and observe what happens to y, and you'll see for yourself. Yep.
Well, but if the exponent for k is alpha and the exponent for L is 1 minus alpha, how would you ever get them to add up to more than?
Yeah, good question. So we are assuming this is a specific form of the Cobb-Douglas production function that this is the constant returns to scale Cobb-Douglas production function. In reality, the Cobb-Douglas production function can take this form, A times K to the alpha, L to the beta. Okay? And when alpha plus beta greater than 1, increasing returns to scale. Alpha plus beta equals 1, constant returns to scale, which is exactly what this one is right here. Alpha plus beta less than 1, decreasing returns to scale. Make sense?
What is beta then?
Beta is just some other parameter on L. In the constant returns to scale case, we assume that it's the it's labor share of income, because they both sum up to 1.
Is that greater than 1 or that equals 1 is increasing?
Yes, when they sum up to greater than 1, it's
Greater
increasing.
than
When they sum up and equal 1, it's constant, and when it's less than 1, it's decreasing. Okay? So, from here, we can observe the effects of economic growth, or at least the effect of capital accumulation on economic growth in the solo growth. So true or false, both the Herod-Domar model and the solo growth model assume constant returns to scale. True, okay? It's a simplifying assumption, don't forget it. True or false, they both assume fixed coefficient production functions.
False.
False. Herod-Domar assumes fixed, solo floating. Okay? It's variable, it can change. Okay, so the first analysis that we do anytime we have some given production function, say y is a function of capital and labor, is to put it in per capita terms. We divide both sides by L, and we are left with y over L equals F K over L. We put our production function in per capita terms. Why do we do that? Because we care about per capita income, we don't just care about aggregate income. Right? China has a lot of aggregate income, but their per capita income is still much lower than America's. Okay? As Gideon Rockman points out in his article at least. Okay? Now, specifically, we claim that big Y over L, or income per capita, can be expressed with a lowercase cursive y, and that capital stock per capita, big K over L, can be expressed with a lowercase cursive k. Therefore, claim that little y is a function of little k in the solo growth model. Now, to see why that's the case, let's take our prior production function and let's put it in per capita terms. So how do I put it in per capita terms? What do I do? Anyway, divide both sides by L. Okay? So step 1, step 2. We're going to divide both sides by L. We get little y equals 10 times k to the 1/2. Now what does L to the 1/2 divided by L equal? What's that? L to the negative 1/2. Very good. Somebody knows their exponents well. So this becomes L to the 1/2, right?